My husband called at 2 a.m. begging me to rush to a deserted road because my sister had crashed my SUV. I found blood on the bumper, but no sister. Before I could call for help, something heavy slammed into the back of my head. I woke up handcuffed to a hospital bed, reeking of vodka, under arrest for a fatal DUI. The setup was flawless. My sister played innocent. My husband played the tragic spouse. As the judge sentenced me to 3 years, I realized they hadn't just framed me to cover up a crime, they did it to clear the path for each other. They thought a concrete cell would silence me. Instead, it gave me 1,000 days to plan their absolute ruin. Drop a comment below and tell me where you're listening from. I stood in front of the heavy mirror in the executive washroom, adjusting the collar of my blazer. Through the thick mahogany door, I could hear the faint murmur of the board members gathering in the main conference room. Today was supposed to be a historic day for Sterling Logistics. In exactly 10 minutes, my husband Julian would step up to the podium. He would pop a bottle of vintage champagne Smile for the industry photographers and officially accept his new title as Chief Executive Officer. He was about to take everything I had built. I checked my watch. 8:55 a.m. Downstairs in the main lobby, 3 black SUVs were pulling up to the curb. Federal agents were currently stepping out carrying a stack of warrants thick enough to ruin a dozen lives. Today, Julian was going to become a CEO, and an hour from now, he would become inmate 8492. Oh. I smoothed out the lapel of my jacket. To understand how I managed to dismantle his entire life in a single morning, you have to understand what he did to mine. You have to go back exactly 3 years. The phone vibrated against the nightstand at 2:14 a.m. I grabbed it blindly in the dark. Julian's name glowed on the screen. He was supposed to be in New York for a logistics summit. Julian! My voice was thick with sleep. Claire, listen to me. His voice was frantic, the words rushing together. It's Chloe. She took your SUV. She's on Pine Ridge Road. I sat up, the cold air of the bedroom hitting my shoulders. What are you talking about? Chloe is supposed to be at home. She's not. She just called me crying hysterically. She hit something, Claire. Or someone. The car is wrecked and she's panicking. My flight is grounded at JFK due to the storm. I can't get there. You need to go right now. I didn't ask questions. Chloe was 28, but my parents had raised her to be perpetually helpless. Every mess she made, I was the one expected to clean it up. I threw on a pair of jeans, a loose silk blouse, and my trench coat. I grabbed my spare keys and ran out to the garage. 10 minutes later, I was driving my secondary sedan down the winding stretch of Pine Ridge Road. It was an isolated, heavily wooded route on the outskirts of the city. Thick fog rolled off the nearby lake, clinging to the asphalt and reflecting the glare of my headlights. The trees loomed on either side like silent spectators. 2 miles down, I saw it. My black SUV was angled sharply into the ditch. The passenger side door was flung wide open. The headlights were still on, cutting 2 useless beams into the dense fog. I slammed my car into park, leaving the engine running, and sprinted toward the wreck. Chloe. The silence swallowed my voice. The driver's seat was empty. The airbag hadn't deployed, but the front bumper was completely crushed against a thick oak tree. I walked around to the front of the vehicle. My boots crunched against the loose gravel. The fog was so thick I could barely see the hood ornament. I pulled out my phone, turning on the flashlight, and shined it down at the damage. There was a massive dent in the grille, and right below it, smeared across the cracked headlight housing, was dark, thick blood. My stomach dropped. Julian said she hit someone. Chloe, where are you? I stepped closer to the bumper, bending down to inspect the undercarriage, praying I wouldn't find a body trapped underneath. I never heard the footsteps. A heavy, solid object slammed into the base of my skull. The impact sounded like a wet branch snapping. White light exploded behind my eyes. My knees buckled instantly, hitting the wet asphalt. I couldn't scream. My vocal cords were completely paralyzed by the shockwave of pain radiating down my spine. I collapsed onto my side, gasping for air that wouldn't come. My vision swam. A pair of custom Italian leather Oxfords stepped into my line of sight. Julian's shoes, the ones I bought him for his birthday last month. He wasn't in New York. Strong hands grabbed me by the shoulders, hauling my dead weight off the ground. I couldn't fight back. My limbs felt like they were filled with wet cement. He dragged me to the open door of the SUV and shoved me into the driver's seat. I slumped against the steering wheel. Through my blurring vision, I saw Julian's face. He wasn't frantic. He was completely calm. His jaw was set tight. He unscrewed the cap of a glass bottle. The harsh, stinging scent of cheap vodka flooded the small cabin. He poured it directly onto my silk blouse. The cold liquid soaked through to my skin, running down my neck. He tilted my head back and poured a splash roughly into my mouth, making me choke and cough. He tossed the empty bottle onto the passenger floorboard. Then he reached up and pulled the dash cam unit off the windshield, slipping it into his coat pocket. He stepped back, closed the door, and the world faded to black. The steady, rhythmic beep of a monitor pulled me out of the darkness. The smell of rubbing alcohol and sterile linens filled my nose. I opened my eyes, wincing at the harsh fluorescent light above. My neck throbbed with an intense, sickening pressure. I tried to reach up to touch the back of my head. My right arm stopped moving halfway up. Metal clinked sharply against metal. I turned my head. A heavy steel handcuff secured my wrist to the metal railing of the hospital bed. "Good morning, Mrs. Sterling." A uniformed police officer stood at the foot of my bed. He had a notepad in his hands and a look of absolute disgust on his face. Where is my husband?" My throat felt like sandpaper. The lingering taste of vodka coated my tongue. The officer didn't answer the question. He stepped forward, his hand resting casually on his utility belt. "Claire Sterling, you are under arrest for felony driving under the influence resulting in vehicular manslaughter. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." I stared at him, the words echoing in the sterile room. Manslaughter. I looked down at the handcuff cutting into my wrist and then back at the door, half expecting Julian to walk in and fix this. It took me exactly 10 seconds to realize he wasn't coming to save me. He was the one who put me here. The visiting room at the county jail smelled like stale coffee and floor wax. I sat on one side of the scratched plexiglass divider, the orange fabric of my jumpsuit itching against my skin. My parents sat on the other side. My father stood pacing the narrow length of the booth, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his slacks. He wouldn't look at me. My mother sat in the plastic chair, clutching a crumpled tissue, her mascara completely ruined. She slid a thick document through the narrow slot at the bottom of the glass. "Sign it, Claire," she whispered. I looked down. It was a plea deal. Pleading guilty to vehicular manslaughter. "I wasn't driving, Mom." My voice was flat. "Chloe took the car. Julian called me to the scene." My father stopped pacing. He finally looked at me, his jaw tight. "There is no proof of that. The police found you in the driver's seat. They found your fingerprints on the bottle. Chloe was fast asleep in her bed when the police knocked on our door. Because Julian took her home before the cops arrived." "Stop it." My mother slammed her hand against the glass. Her face was red, contorted in a mix of panic and desperation. "Think of the family, Claire. Chloe is 28. She has her whole life ahead of her. She can't survive in a place like this. You're strong. You've always been the strong one." I stared at the woman who raised me. The silence in the small booth was deafening. They knew. They didn't have all the details, but they knew their golden child had done something terrible, and they were explicitly asking me to take the cage meant for her. "If you fight this, the press will destroy all of us." My father added, his tone lowering to a businesslike cadence. "Take the deal. The judge will go easy on you for cooperating." I pushed the document back through the slot. I'm not taking the fall for her. My mother let out a sharp sob, burying her face in her hands. My father grabbed the papers, his face hardening into a cold, unfamiliar mask. He didn't say another word. They walked out of the visiting room together, leaving me completely alone. 3 weeks later, we went to trial. I sat at the defense table next to a public defender who looked like he hadn't slept in a month. He tried to introduce my medical records, specifically the blunt force trauma to the back of my neck. The prosecutor objected immediately. The judge dismissed the injury as standard whiplash from striking the steering wheel. Then, Julian took the stand. He wore a conservative charcoal suit. He had dark circles expertly shaded under his eyes. He looked exactly like a grieving, exhausted husband. "Mr. Sterling," the prosecutor began softly, "did your wife have a history of drinking?" Julian looked down at his hands. He took a slow, shaky breath. "She's been under an immense amount of pressure lately. Running the company. It was taking a toll on her. I started finding empty bottles hidden in her home office. I tried to get her help. I really did. I just didn't think she would ever get behind the wheel." He looked directly at me. His eyes were perfectly wide, brimming with manufactured sorrow. My public defender didn't even object. Chloe testified next. She wore a simple white blouse, her hair tied back in a neat, innocent ponytail. "I was asleep," she told the jury, her voice trembling perfectly on cue. "Claire let me borrow her car earlier that day, but I brought it back. I had no idea she went out again. If I had known she was drinking, I would have stopped her." She wiped a tear from her cheek. The jury ate out of the palm of her hand. Closing arguments wrapped up by Friday morning. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. When the foreperson stood up to read the verdict, I didn't hold my breath. I already knew the ending. The system wasn't broken. It was operating exactly as it was designed to when fed the right lies. "Guilty." The gavel cracked against the wooden block, echoing through the high-ceilinged room. 36 months in a state penitentiary. 3 years. The bailiff stepped forward, grabbing my arm to lead me toward the side door. I stopped. I turned my head to look back at the gallery one last time. I wanted to see my parents' faces. I wanted to see if they looked relieved. They were already walking toward the exit. But Julian and Chloe were standing near the front row. Julian was whispering something to her. As she turned to follow my parents, his hand dropped to her side. His fingers brushed against the small of her back. It wasn't a comforting gesture between a brother-in-law and a sister. It was an intimate, lingering touch. Chloe leaned her weight into his hand for a fraction of a second, offering a small, secretive smile before walking away. The heavy courtroom door closed behind me, cutting off the view. The air in my lungs turned to ice. My legs stopped moving. The bailiff had to yank my arm to get me walking down the concrete hallway toward holding. It wasn't just a cover-up to protect Chloe from a drunk driving charge. My husband didn't frame me just to save my sister. They were together. They had used my car, my life, and a dead pedestrian to clear the path for themselves. And in a few hours I would be on a bus to a maximum security prison, leaving them with the keys to my house and full control of my bank accounts. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. As the guard locked the heavy steel door of my holding cell, I walked over to the narrow concrete bench and sat down. I had 1,095 days to figure out how to burn their entire world to the ground. State correctional facilities do not care about who you are outside their walls. They strip you of your clothes, your name, and your schedule. I became inmate 40982. The first night, the woman in the bunk below me sobbed for 6 hours straight. I lay on the thin, scratchy mattress staring at the concrete ceiling. I didn't shed a single tear. Crying required energy, and I needed every ounce of mine for something else. We were allowed 15 minutes of phone time a week. Every Tuesday at exactly 9 a.m., I stood at the scratched plastic terminal in the common room, waiting for the dial tone. I never called my parents. I never called Chloe. I only called Marcus. He was a criminal defense attorney, but over the first 6 months of my sentence, he became my sole proxy to the outside world. "He's moving the money," Marcus said during our call in week 24. His voice was clipped, fighting through the heavy static of the prison line. "Julian's using the logistics operational fund. He's masking it as vendor payouts, but he's actually funneling it to buy out the minority shareholders." I pressed the heavy receiver tighter against my ear. I kept my eyes fixed on the gray cinderblock wall ahead of me. He wants the 60% majority. He wants the authority to permanently remove me. "He's close," Marcus warned, "but Diane is holding the line." Diane, the oldest member of the board. She had stayed perfectly silent during the trial, never offering a public statement. I had assumed she abandoned me too. "She cornered me in the parking lot yesterday." Marcus continued, his voice dropping an octave. "She told me to give you a message. She said the corporate bylaws require a unanimous board agreement to expedite an absentee ouster. She's refusing to sign. She's filing endless procedural grievances." "How long can she stall him?" 3 years, Marcus said. "If she uses every loophole in the charter, she can block the final vote until the exact month your sentence is up. But Claire Julian is tearing the company apart to get those shares." "Let him." The line went quiet for a second. "Excuse me. Let him empty the operational funds. Let him buy every single share he can get his hands on. Document the routing numbers, Marcus. Track every dollar he pulls from Sterling Logistics. If he gets the majority, you walk out of there with nothing." "Just track the money," I ordered. The automated voice cut in, warning us we had 60 seconds remaining. "What about the vehicle data?" I heard the rustle of papers on his end. "The police impounded the SUV, but it was released to Julian's insurance adjusters 2 weeks ago. He had it scrapped. The physical dash cam was missing from the evidence log entirely." "I don't care about the dash cam," I said, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper. I glanced over my shoulder at a passing guard. "It's a company fleet vehicle, Marcus. I had our proprietary logistics software installed in the onboard computer before I ever handed Chloe the keys. It syncs to a hidden cloud server. It logs GPS velocity and cabin audio. It records everything." "I tried to access the node you told me about," Marcus said quickly, racing against the clock. "It's completely walled off. Top-tier encryption. I can't get in." "You need the master passcode." "No. The protocol changed. It's prompting for biometric authentication. Your fingerprint, Claire. Or a physical override key generated directly from your personal secure terminal." "The terminal in my home office." "Yes. The house Julian is currently living in." 10 seconds remaining, the automated voice droned. "I'll get it," I said. "How you're locked in a cell." The line went dead. The sharp dial tone buzzed in my ear. I hung up the receiver. I stood there for a moment, the noise of the crowded day room buzzing around me. I didn't have access to the internet. I didn't have a computer. I had a cinderblock cell and a uniform. But Julian wanted my company. To get it, he would eventually have to come to me. And when he did, I would be waiting. Month 14. The visitation room on the east wing had a thick plexiglass divider. It was heavily scratched right at eye level, distorting the faces of anyone sitting on the other side. Julian pulled out the metal chair opposite mine. He wore a tailored navy suit. The fabric draped flawlessly over his shoulders. His hair was freshly trimmed, his watch catching the harsh fluorescent light. He looked like a man who had spent his morning at a private country club, not a man visiting his incarcerated wife. I sat in my plastic chair. My orange jumpsuit was faded, pooling around my ankles. I kept my shoulders slumped, my spine curved forward. I let my unbrushed hair hang loose around my face. He picked up the heavy black receiver on his side of the glass. I picked up mine. "You look tired, Claire," he said. His voice was smooth, carrying that practiced, gentle cadence he used to close deals in the boardroom. I looked down at the metal counter. I made sure my fingers trembled slightly as I rested them near the base of the glass. Julian unbuttoned his jacket and pulled a thick manila envelope from his inner pocket. He slid it through the narrow slot at the bottom of the divider. The third quarter numbers are abysmal. He sighed, shaking his head. Clients are pulling their contracts. The media won't let the accident go. Your name is toxic right now. It's bleeding us dry. I pulled the envelope toward me and opened the flap. It was a standard corporate relinquishment form. Transfer of all voting rights and the CEO title effective, immediately naming Julian Vance as the sole proxy. Diane is fighting me on the temporary leadership transition. Julian continued tapping a gold pen against the glass. But if you sign this voluntarily, her procedural objections won't matter. I can stabilize the stock. I can save what you built. I stared at the signature line at the bottom of the page. Sign it, Claire, he urged softly. At least this way you'll still have some value to the company. I picked up the pen he had pushed through the slot. I positioned the tip over the dotted line. I let my hand shake violently enough that the pen tapped audibly against the paper. I looked up, meeting his eyes. I let a single tear pool in my lower lash line, blinking rapidly to keep it from falling. There's a liability clause missing in Section 4, I whispered into the receiver. Julian frowned. The gentle mask slipped for a fraction of a second. What? The indemnification clause. If I sign this exactly as it is written, the minority shareholders can sue me personally for the recent quarter losses. I set the pen down slowly, pulling my hands back into my lap. Marcus needs to review this. He has to draft an addendum before I put my name on it. Julian leaned forward, his breath briefly fogging the plexiglass. We don't have time for your lawyer to drag his feet. The board meets next week. I won't sign a flawed contract, I said, my voice cracking perfectly. You know I wouldn't. You're right, Julian. This company needs someone worthy. I paused, letting my gaze harden just a fraction. But it isn't you. His jaw snapped shut. The veins in his neck pushed against his starched white collar. He hated being challenged, especially by someone he considered already defeated. He snatched the documents back through the slot, moving so fast he nearly tore the heavy parchment paper. Have Marcus call my office by Friday, Julian snapped. He slammed the receiver onto the hook, stood up, and walked out of the visitation room without looking back. The heavy steel door clicked shut behind him. I placed my receiver back on the cradle. I sat back in the hard plastic chair. I reached up and casually wiped the unshed tear from my eye. I looked down at my hands. They were perfectly steady. A legal review of a corporate transfer of that magnitude would take Marcus at least 6 months to stall in arbitration. 6 months of back-and-forth paperwork. 6 months of red tape. That was exactly how much time Diane needed to finish laying the financial trap. Month 35. Marcus didn't use the standard visitation booths anymore. As my attorney of record, he booked the private consultation room's windowless cinderblock cubes with a single steel table. He unlatched his leather briefcase, pulled out a thick legal pad, and slid it across the metal surface. Look under the notepad, he said quietly. I lifted the heavy cardboard backing. 3 glossy photographs lay face down. I flipped them over. The background was a snow-covered patio. A luxury ski resort in Aspen. Julian was wearing a tailored winter coat, holding a champagne flute. Chloe was standing pressed against his side, wearing a white fur-lined parka. In the second photo, they were kissing. In the third, Chloe was holding her left hand up to her chest, laughing at something off camera. The sunlight caught the massive, brilliant-cut diamond sitting on her ring finger. I didn't scream. I didn't throw the pictures. I just stared at the crystalline glare of the diamond. My thumb traced the edge of the glossy paper. A dry, jagged laugh scraped the back of my throat. Private investigator? I asked, sliding the photos back under the notepad. Diane hired him, Marcus replied, loosening his tie. She thought you needed to see exactly what we're up against. But that's not why I'm here today. He pulled a fresh document from his briefcase. The header bore the official seal of the board of directors. He's done waiting, Claire. Julian filed a formal petition yesterday morning to invoke Section 8 of the corporate charter. I looked up. The morality clause. Yes, a felony conviction is grounds for immediate termination of the chief executive. Diane has exhausted every procedural delay she legally can. She can't block a vote on a felony clause. Marcus tapped his pen against the table. The emergency board meeting is scheduled for this Friday, 9 a.m. I leaned back in the cold metal chair. Friday. My official release date. Processing would take until 7 a.m. He timed it perfectly, I said. I walk out of the gate, and before I even hit the city limits, he legally strips me of my company. He holds 40% of the proxy votes now, Marcus said, his voice tightening. Combined with the 3 board members he's bought off, he has the supermajority. He's going to win the vote, Claire. Did Diane finish the forensic audit? Marcus stopped tapping his pen. He opened a separate locked compartment in his briefcase. He didn't pull the file out, just gave me a sharp nod. Every single dollar. She traced the shell companies. Julian routed $15 million from the operational reserves to buy those minority proxy votes. I kept my eyes locked on his. Print 3 physical copies. Do not submit them to the SEC. Do not file them with the courts. Claire, if we don't file the injunction before Friday. I said don't file it. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the steel table. Bring the audit to the main lobby of the Sterling building on Friday morning. Have a car waiting for me outside the prison gates at 7:05 a.m. Marcus stared at me for a long moment. He closed his briefcase and snapped the brass latches shut. You're going to crash the board meeting. I'm going to end it. That night, after the lights out siren wailed through the cell block, I sat on the edge of my thin mattress. I reached under the metal frame and pulled out a small, sharpened piece of graphite I had traded 3 commissary meals for. I turned to the concrete wall beside my pillow. It was covered in vertical scratches. Symmetrical rows grouping days into weeks, weeks into months, months into 3 years of absolute silence. 1,094 lines. I pressed the graphite against the cold, porous stone. I dragged it down, carving a deep, dark slash through the final group. 1,095. I brushed the stone dust from my fingertips. The waiting was over. Tomorrow the empire was mine again. The heavy steel gate of the penitentiary slid shut behind me. The metallic crash echoed through the freezing morning air, signaling the end of 1,095 days. Marcus was waiting at the curb, leaning against a black town car. A pristine garment bag hung from the rear passenger window. I walked up to him. I didn't look at the garment bag. Instead, I tore open the clear plastic inventory sack the corrections officer had handed me 5 minutes ago. I pulled out the clothes I had worn on the night of the accident. The silk blouse was stiff. The dark brown stains across the collar and chest had thoroughly oxidized, turning into rigid, crusty patches. It smelled faintly of stale vodka and a sterile evidence locker. I took off my gray prison-issue sweatshirt, dropping it directly onto the asphalt, and slipped my arms into the stained silk. Marcus watched me button the ruined shirt. He opened his mouth, let out a slow breath, and closed it. He reached past me and opened the car door. We didn't speak during the 40-minute drive into the city. I watched the sprawling concrete of the highway turn into the towering glass facades of the downtown district. The car pulled up to the curb. Sterling Tower. I stepped out onto the pavement. The morning rush was in full swing, people bustling past with coffees and briefcases. I pushed through the heavy revolving doors and stepped into the expansive marble lobby. The low hum of morning chatter died instantly. Sarah, the head receptionist I had hired 5 years ago, froze with her hand hovering awkwardly over her keyboard. A coffee cup slipped from an intern's hand near the elevators, shattering against the polished stone floor. A security guard near the turnstiles stepped forward, his hand dropping instinctively to the radio on his hip. I didn't slow my pace. I didn't break my stride. I kept my eyes locked dead on his. He swallowed hard, his hand sliding off the radio. He took a distinct step backward, clearing the path to the executive elevator bank. I swiped the master keycard Marcus had handed me in the car. The green light blinked. The steel doors slid open. I stepped inside and hit the button for the 34th floor. The elevator ascended in absolute silence. No music. Just the slight hum of the cables pulling me higher. Ding. The doors parted. The executive floor was exactly as I had left it. Deep carpet, muted lighting, modern art on the walls. Straight ahead was the main conference room. The walls were floor-to-ceiling frosted glass, leaving only a clear strip at eye level. I walked silently down the corridor. Through the clear pane, I could see them. 12 board members sat around the massive mahogany table. At the head of the table stood Julian. He wore a bespoke light gray suit. He was smiling brilliantly, his teeth flashing as he finished telling some kind of joke. The board members chuckled. Julian picked up a crystal flute of champagne from the table, raising it toward the center of the room. He was preparing to toast. To the new era. To his official reign. I didn't knock. I planted my hands flat against the heavy double-glass doors and pushed them wide open. The heavy glass doors hit the stops with a sharp crack. Conversation in the room died instantly. Julian's hand froze mid-air, the crystal flute hovering inches from his lips. 12 pairs of eyes snapped toward the entrance, taking in the dried blood on my collar, the wrinkled silk, and the undeniable smell of a prison evidence locker that clung to me. Julian slowly lowered his glass. He placed it carefully onto the polished mahogany. The brilliant smile he had worn a second ago hardened into a tight, flat line. "Claire," he said, stepping out from behind the head chair. "You're early." I didn't answer. I walked past the row of seated executives, my boots sinking into the plush carpet, and stopped at the empty chair at the opposite end of the long table. I pulled it out and sat down. Julian cleared his throat, adjusting his cuffs. "As much as we are relieved to see you out, this is a closed executive session. We are in the middle of a critical vote." "I know," I said. "Then you know you need to leave." He placed both hands flat on the table, leaning forward to project authority. Section 8 of the Charter is clear. A convicted felon cannot hold a board seat or an executive title. You don't have a voice in this room anymore. The vote proceeds right now. He looked at the 3 minority shareholders sitting to his left. They nodded, keeping their eyes firmly fixed on their legal pads, refusing to look in my direction. "Call the vote," Julian ordered the secretary. Diane stood up. She reached into her oversized leather tote, pulled out a 3-inch thick binder, and dropped it dead center on the mahogany table. The heavy thud echoed against the glass walls. "You thought you were buying the company, Julian?" Diane asked. Her voice was quiet, lacking any of her usual aristocratic polish. "No. You just bought yourself a ticket to federal prison." Julian blinked. He looked at the binder, then back at Diane. "What is this?" I reached forward, flipped the heavy cover open, and slid the first printed spreadsheet down the center of the table. $15 million. I said, my voice carrying easily across the silence. Routed from the operational reserves into a holding LLC in the Cayman Islands, and then transferred directly into the private accounts of the 3 gentlemen sitting to your left. The 3 board members flinched. One of them actually dropped his pen. Julian's face drained of color. He stared at the spreadsheet. The routing numbers, the timestamps, the digital signatures, everything was there in black and white. "This is a fabrication," Julian shot back, his voice rising a fraction too high. "This is a desperate stunt to stall the vote. I hold 40% of the proxy. I have. The supermajority. Corporate Bylaws Article 4. I recited, leaning back in my chair. Any proxy shares acquired through embezzled company funds are immediately frozen and stripped of all voting rights. I looked at the three minority shareholders. Your shares are locked. You don't have a supermajority, Julian. You don't even have a quorum. He stared at me. The pristine facade cracked entirely. A vein throbbed near his temple. He opened his mouth to speak, to spin a new lie, to find a loophole that didn't exist. I didn't give him the chance. The shares you bought with stolen money are officially void, I said. Pack your things and get out of my building, Julian. I reached over to the built-in console on the table and pressed the intercom button. Security to the executive boardroom, please. You can't do this. Julian slammed his fist onto the table. The champagne flutes rattled. I kept this place running. I saved it while you were rotting in a cell. The glass doors opened. The two security guards from the lobby stepped inside. They didn't look confused. They walked straight past me, flanking Julian on either side. Sir, the taller guard said, grabbing Julian by the bicep. It's time to go. Julian jerked his arm away, but the second guard grabbed his other shoulder, locking him in a firm grip. They hauled him backward, pulling him away from the head of the table. His Italian leather shoes dragged across the carpet. The remaining board members sat in stunned silence, watching the man they were about to crown get physically removed from the room. Julian fought against the grip, his face twisting into something ugly and desperate. He locked eyes with me as they dragged him toward the elevator bank. You get the desk, Claire! He screamed, his voice echoing through the corridor outside. But you're still a felon. You're going to wear that manslaughter charge for the rest of your life. The elevator doors slid shut, cutting off his voice. I looked down at the empty crystal champagne flute he had left on the table. He was right about one thing. Taking the company back wasn't enough. It was time to clear my name. Level 4 of the downtown parking garage was empty at 9 o'clock at night. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, flickering against the damp concrete. Julian's Mercedes was parked diagonally across two spaces. He stood leaning against the driver's side door. His tie was gone. The top button of his custom shirt was torn off. A set of headlights swept across the concrete pillars. Chloe's white coupe pulled up and stopped a few feet away. She stepped out, pulling her coat tight against the chill. Julian. She walked toward him, her heels echoing in the vast space. You texted me to come right now. What happened at the board meeting? He didn't walk forward to greet her. He didn't reach out to pull her close. The SEC is opening an inquiry by tomorrow morning, he said. His voice was entirely flat. The smooth, practiced warmth was completely gone. Marcus filed a forensic audit with the federal prosecutor an hour ago. Chloe stopped. Her hand tightened on her purse. What does that mean? It means they know about the 15 million. Julian pushed off the car. He closed the distance between them in 3 long strides. They know about the shell accounts. They are going to issue a warrant for my arrest. Oh my God. She breathed, her eyes widening. We have to hire a lawyer. We have to. You have to confess. Chloe froze. The air in the garage seemed to drop 10 degrees. What? You are going to walk into the federal building tomorrow at 8 in the morning. Julian ordered, his tone clipping every syllable. You are going to tell the prosecutor that you orchestrated the transfers. You had my login credentials. You moved the money without my knowledge. She stared at him, her mouth opening and closing before any sound came out. I didn't steal that money. I don't even know how to set up an offshore account. You will learn the script tonight. No. She took a step backward. You said we were getting married. You said we were going to run the company together once Claire was gone. Julian lunged forward. He grabbed her left arm, his fingers digging into her bicep, and shoved her backward until her spine slammed against a concrete pillar. Chloe gasped, dropping her purse. Julian reached into his trousers. He pulled out a small silver flash drive. He held it up, pressing the cold metal directly against her cheek. Do you know what this is? He whispered. Chloe's breathing hitched. She looked cross-eyed at the small device pressing into her skin. It's the raw dashcam footage from Pine Ridge Road, he said softly. The interior cabin view, the GPS logs, the audio of you sobbing as you hit that pedestrian. Chloe started shaking. Her perfectly manicured hands gripped his wrist, trying to pull the device away from her face. You told me you destroyed it. I kept it. He pressed the metal harder against her cheek. If I go down for embezzlement, I am handing this directly to the district attorney. Vehicular manslaughter. Fleeing the scene of a fatal accident. Conspiracy to obstruct justice. You won't get 3 years like your sister did. You will get 15. He stepped back, letting go of her arm. Chloe slumped against the pillar, wrapping her arms around her own ribs. She looked at the man she had worn a diamond ring for. Julian tossed the flash drive onto the hood of her car. It landed with a sharp clink. Memorize the script, he said, turning his back on her. You have until tomorrow morning. He got into his Mercedes, started the engine, and drove away without looking back. At 11:42 p.m., there was a knock on the door of my temporary hotel room. I set my laptop on the desk and walked over to the door. I looked through the peephole. I didn't hesitate. I turned the deadbolt and pulled the door open. Chloe stood in the hallway. Her mascara was running down her cheeks in thick, dark streaks. Her hair was tangled. She was shaking violently, though the hallway was perfectly heated. She didn't speak. She slowly raised her right hand. Resting in the center of her trembling palm was a small silver flash drive. He's going to destroy me. She choked out her voice, barely a whisper. I looked at the drive. I looked at the girl who had let me sleep on a concrete slab for 3 years to save her own skin. I reached out and picked the drive up from her palm. The metal was warm. Yes, I said. He is. I stepped back, leaving the door open. Chloe walked into the hotel room, her arms wrapped tightly around her own ribs. I didn't offer her a tissue. I didn't point her to a chair. I took the silver flash drive from her palm, walked over to the desk, and slid it into the USB port of my laptop. I clicked the only video file in the directory. Audio instantly filled the quiet room. The sickening thud of a heavy impact against metal followed immediately by Chloe's hysterical, hyperventilating sobs. Chloe covered her ears, squeezing her eyes shut. I gave it to you. I brought you the proof. Please, Claire, you have to tell the police he forced me to keep quiet. I pulled the drive from the port. I turned around and looked at the woman standing on my carpet. You think handing this over means I forgive you? I kept my voice perfectly level. You are still going to wear the exact same orange jumpsuit I wore. The only difference is I was innocent. You are not. The breath left Chloe's lungs in a single ragged exhale. Her knees gave out. She slumped against the edge of the mattress, burying her face in her hands, realizing the transaction she thought she was making didn't exist. I picked up my cell phone and hit speed dial. Marcus, I said when the line clicked open, I have the physical drive. Call the bureau. Tell them he's going to run. At 6:15 a.m., the Lincoln Park townhouse was completely dark, save for the pendant lights hanging over the granite kitchen island. Julian's leather duffel bag sat open on the counter. He tossed in 3 banded stacks of $100 bills, a prepaid burner phone, and his navy blue passport. He zipped the bag shut, his breathing shallow and rapid in the quiet house. He reached for his car keys. Crack! The solid oak front door splintered inward, the deadbolt tearing completely through the wood frame. FBI federal agents, hands in the air. Julian dropped the keys. He spun toward the back patio doors, taking exactly 2 steps before a tactical officer in heavy body armor tackled him waist deep, driving him straight into the hardwood floor. Hands behind your back. Stop resisting. Zip ties ratcheted shut around his wrists, biting deep into his skin. I stood on the sidewalk across the street, the crisp morning wind biting at the edges of my trench coat. I held a paper coffee cup in my right hand. Marcus stood beside me, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. 2 agents hauled Julian out the front door. He wasn't wearing a tie. His custom shirt was torn at the shoulder seam, his hair wild and unkempt. He blinked rapidly against the flashing red and blue lights of the federal cruisers blocking the residential street. Neighbors were stepping out onto their porches, pulling their robes tight, holding up their cell phones. Julian stumbled down the porch steps. Then he raised his head and saw me. He stopped fighting the agents. His eyes locked onto mine across the asphalt. The panic in his expression morphed instantly into pure, unhinged venom. "This is a setup!" He screamed, the sound tearing from his throat, echoing off the brick townhouses. He thrashed against the agent's grip, twisting his body toward the gathered neighbors. "It's a lie Chloe drove the car. That bitch set me up. You're arresting the wrong man." I didn't blink. I didn't raise my voice to argue. I took a slow sip of my black coffee. The lead agent didn't even pause to listen. He shoved a heavy hand against the back of Julian's neck, forcing his head down and shoving him roughly into the back of the federal vehicle. The heavy door slammed shut, severing his voice from the street. The siren wailed, and the cruiser pulled away from the curb. The wooden gavel struck the sounding block. The sharp crack echoed through the high-ceilinged courtroom. "The prior conviction is hereby vacated," the appellate judge announced, looking directly at me. "Claire Sterling is fully exonerated of all charges, effective immediately." I stood at the defense table. Marcus snapped his leather briefcase shut beside me. The invisible crushing weight I had carried for 3 years didn't vanish in some grand dramatic wave. It simply ceased to exist. Across the center aisle, the federal marshals were already moving. Chloe wore the standard-issue orange jumpsuit. Her wrists were secured in heavy iron cuffs at her waist. The judge had handed down her sentence 20 minutes earlier. 60 months. 5 years in a federal correctional facility. She stopped walking. She looked over her shoulder as the marshals guided her toward the side door. Our eyes met across the room. I didn't smile. I didn't offer a reassuring nod. I stood perfectly still, my hands resting lightly on the polished oak table, and watched her disappear behind the heavy wooden door. 2 days later, my cell phone vibrated against the marble counter of my apartment. I looked at the glowing screen. I pressed the green icon and put the phone on speaker, setting it down next to the coffee maker. "Claire, please." My mother's voice was ragged, thick with exhaustion and tears. "You have the best lawyers. Marcus knows the appellate judges. You can petition for a sentence reduction. She won't survive 5 years in that place." I picked up the glass carafe and poured a cup of black coffee. The dark liquid steamed in the morning air. "Claire, are you listening to me? She is your sister." I picked up the mug. "You chose to protect a killer instead of believing your own daughter." My voice was completely steady. It didn't waver. "Every choice has a price. Do not call this number again." I tapped the red icon. I opened the contact settings. I hit block. The apartment was perfectly quiet. At 8 o'clock, I walked through the revolving doors of the Sterling Tower. The lobby was silent as I passed, but this time nobody dropped their coffee. The security guards nodded respectfully. The receptionist offered a sharp, polite greeting. The elevator took me directly to the 34th floor. I opened the heavy glass doors to the chief executive's office. The morning sun flooded through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long golden lines across the pristine mahogany desk. Diane was already there, waiting by the bookshelf with a tablet in her hands. "The final buyout papers for Julian's voided shares are ready for your signature," she said. "The SEC confirmed his initial hearing is set for next Tuesday. He's looking at 20 years. "Leave the papers on the desk," I said. She set the tablet down. She walked toward the door, pausing just before turning the handle. "Welcome back, Claire." "Thank you, Diane." The door clicked shut. I walked around the massive desk and stood facing the windows. Down below the city was a vast grid of moving cars and rushing people, completely unaware of the empire that had just been torn down and rebuilt above them. I took a sip of the dark coffee. I didn't have a family anymore. I didn't have a husband. But as I looked out over the skyline watching the morning light catch the edge of the glass towers, I realized something else. I had exactly what I paid for. I had everything.